Hello, I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to Vibecast. Thank you for joining us as we explore the exciting advancements in technology-enabled collaboration to excel important drug development. Vibe Bio seeks to find every cure for every community. We think big as no one should be left behind in the pursuit of living a healthy, happy, and productive life free from disease. Collectively, we have the skills, we have the technology, and we have the passion. We now need the community catalyst to bring that all together, and that's Vibe. We see a future where communities of biopharma experts and patients collaborate to identify high potential medicines and have the ability to access capital on demand to actually develop them. The Vibecast is our weekly informational podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development and technology innovation with some of the dynamic people that make up the Vibe community. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is Ethan Perlstein, who I actually first met in person at the SynBio Beta conference in Oakland earlier this year. In 2014, Ethan founded Perlera, PBC, which is the first biotech public benefit company. And they help patients navigate finding treatments for their complex diseases, and I'm sure many other things that we'll share today. So, Ethan, welcome to the show.
Oh, super psyched to be here.
Awesome. And if you wouldn't mind giving the audience just a brief background about yourself and sort of how you, your career so far and how you ended up here today.
Yeah, it's been a journey. I guess I became a biotech entrepreneur about 10 years ago when I left academia and sort of realized that I was a founder. I think maybe a lot of people trained in academia, trained to be scientists. I think a lot of them are natural born entrepreneurs, but they may not know it. They don't see many examples of it, maybe. I guess I was one of those people. And they didn't call it founder-led biotech back then yet. It didn't have a name. It was sort of like, oh, you're a postdoc and you couldn't get an academic job, so you're starting a company. Oh, okay. But that's become a thing now. But back then it was, there weren't that many people. There were people like Max Hodak and Elizabeth Irons and a few others that were jumping ship from academia back then. But it wasn't like a commonplace thing to do. And startups weren't, I guess, as cool as they are today. They were certainly very cool to me and others. But I think over the last 10 years, startups have sort of eaten the world. But back then it was kind of still like, especially coming from academia, you're like going from one risky proposition to startups, which were perceived and actually are most startups fail, right? So going from one failure-prone enterprise to another just seemed like, wow, what was I doing? But couldn't be happier and haven't looked back since.
Yeah, and you came, not just from any academic scene. You were at Harvard University. You did a PhD there. You did a postdoc at Princeton. So you were exposed to a lot of these potentially other biotech founders as well, or who got the same sort of like energy and mindset as you. And now, Harvard and I'm sure Princeton, they have their own incubation centers
right.
for
they
the
didn't then.
They
was
didn't
still
then, right?
It was early days. Princeton, I would say, was a late adopter to the whole startup scene. But definitely, yeah. Nowadays, you go to Harvard, you go to Princeton, you go to a lot of places, not just the Ivies, and you see like biotech clubs and biotech accelerators and spaces where companies are incubating. So that definitely has become a mature kind of national scale phenomenon in the last 10 years. It wasn't that way 10 years ago, I can tell you that.
Yeah, that's fair. So let's sort of talk about how, as a scientist, how does form your perspective on life sciences, innovation, policy, and research funding. I know that it's an important area for you. And just want to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I created Perlera to be a very different kind of a biotech and kind of pursue a business model that, is not standard. And so I kind of have always brought that perspective, bit of an outsider perspective, but sort of this idea that, now I would call it what we're doing sort of DTC biotech. And I think we're actually like the first real sort of direct to consumer biotech. But I wouldn't have framed it that way at the beginning of the journey. We were much more, branded and positioned on this public benefit corporation message, and that's still a very, very central message and vision of the company. And there are some other biotech PBCs out there, but it's still sort of a non-standard course. So I think when I think about funding, I think about company creation, and I definitely am not taking the standard point of view, but I think that's good. I'm trying to shine a light on a different type of biotech entrepreneur. I think part of our focus is on rare genetic diseases and helping families that want to help themselves. And I think kind of what we've discovered is that there's a whole possibility for direct to consumer biotech that's kind of built on these kind of unfiltered collaboration between families and scientists that want to advance research together. And I think that's something that has become our differentiator and how we think about the world. But yeah, in terms of funding, I tried the VC route, raised funds from angel investors and from sophisticated investors. Did that for a while, pivoted the company, and now we're a consultancy, and we're funded basically directly by the clients, and our clients are these families pursuing their own treatments and cures. So it's hopefully going to be less of an outsider perspective moving forward, but it's definitely not been the standard course.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me because, going direct to consumer is typically seen as really difficult in many cases, especially in biotech. But you've been able to, gain traction the way you're doing it. So it's really great to prove out that there is a different way. You mentioned that the standard system just wasn't for you, or didn't make sense, or just wasn't as it's probably less interesting too at this point. It's very
it was also, I tried to go to standard way, and a lot of standard investors in biotech didn't appreciate this vision of working so closely with families and letting them kind of guide you to the science, let them decide what diseases to work on. It's a very different mindset, but I definitely tried to make it work with the establishment. They just didn't really, it was kind of ahead of its time then, and I think it's finally, maybe the times have finally caught up.
Yeah, and maybe the families have more of an understanding of the ecosystem potentially to feel more comfortable getting involved in investing or being part of funding this endeavor.
Yeah, every year is almost like a generation in like rare disease time, in that a family gets a diagnosis and arrives on the scene, and they're, they didn't just come out of nowhere. Usually there's a legacy. There's others who have been working before them, other families who have been affected, first. So you don't have to start from scratch. But you see this kind of cycle get faster, where each new family that gets diagnosed, each new generation of rare disease families can look back and stand on the shoulders of others. And it's literally like every couple of years, there's a whole new set of opportunities available to families, and it's moving really, really fast.
That's great to hear. Are you seeing, I guess, what are some of the major problems preventing research funding specifically for rare diseases? Because I know they have their own set of problems, and, in this current modern day economy.
People have tried like crazy to get especially ultra rare. You talk about rare, the reality is it's really that most rare diseases are ultra rare diseases.
Mm-hmm.
So, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, there's like large rare, and those are obviously have more name recognition. But most rare diseases are actually ultra rare. So like 100 to 1,000 patients known in the US or maybe even in the world. So no one has figured out like the traditional biotech industry, its business model, the VC funded company creation model. None of those work for ultra rare. They've all failed. And we've seen many companies get formed on the backs of families and their early stage research programs, have a bunch of ultra rare disease assets bundled together. They thought maybe they could make it work economically by bundling. And at the end of the day, you saw companies blow up like Taysha and others and abandon all of these ultra rare programs. And so I think there really hasn't been a financially, economically productive business model for ultra rare. And I think that's why we've been exploring these alternatives. And it basically comes down to dropping the cost of doing research and finding actionable medicines. You have to drop that cost by like 100-fold, 1,000-fold, in order to make ultra rare disease communities financially interesting, right? Because at the current economics and the current technology, it's just simply too expensive to justify the investment. So the only way to around that problem is some kind of technological advance that's like massively deflationary and drives down the cost of finding these medicines. My whole theory is that what is that massive deflationary force? It's the families. It's pairing up with these very, very motivated, rare disease, ultra rare. Again, rare is really ultra rare. It's pairing up with these communities that have been ignored, but are eager to work. They're not just going to change priorities next quarter, right? They're in it to win it. There's all these things that make up for the fact that they're small in number, but kind of mighty in action. And that's, I think, actually a hack. It's that's until such time that some technology comes to drive down the costs of clinical trials or drive down the costs of arriving at medicine. And like AI is going to do that. Decentralization is going to do that. But like it's going to take some time to do that. What's a deflationary unlock that's available to tomorrow? It's, I think, collaborating with these families because everything just goes faster and therefore it's cheaper, right? And so it's not really a technology per se. It's the fact that it's the motivation of these families that's the platform, right? The parents or the patients are the platform. It's kind of how I say it.
Absolutely. No, I hear you there. My last episode, actually, the last Vibecast was on Lafora disease. And we talked about, and this is an ultra rare disease as well, like typically, I think a few thousand people in the world or less. Mm-hmm. And family communities are a huge part of the way that they're raising money now. They have, a documentary out to raise awareness, but if it wasn't for these patient families, this wouldn't have happened at all. So it's really interesting to see that. And I agree. This shift is sort of happening really quickly, at least from my perspective. I haven't been in as long as you have, but just in the last few years, I think it's a multitude of, or a set of different things affecting it. Digital connectedness, for sure, just being able to talk to people more quickly. COVID probably helped with that a little bit. And I don't know, I know the economy isn't necessarily looking too bright, but it seems like there's still money out there for a lot of companies.
I think the flip was COVID, actually. And for some of the things you said, but also because, remember, there was a time there where there was like 7, 8, 9 different vaccines competing, and they were all different platforms: mRNA, AAV, protein. And then who won? The mRNA vaccine. And mRNA, 10 years ago, there was no such thing as an mRNA medicine. So I think what happened really is that everyone with a rare disease realized that, wait a minute, this was a disease, or COVID was something that, according to the textbooks, it was going to, we might not have a vaccine for years, right? Remember that's what they were saying back in April, May of 2020. And then, we basically had the first responders getting dosed that December of 2020, less than a year before they even found the sequence of the virus. So I think when that really dawned on everybody, and then they saw all the different companies competing and all the different types of vaccines, all the flavors, mRNA, protein, AAV, when everyone realized that was the case, they were like, oh, so it really wasn't the science that was limiting. The tech is all there. It was just a massive global societal conviction that we must do this. And governments and everybody kind of like top down, like saying we're going to do this because everyone's life is at stake on the planet. So I think when every rare disease family saw that and then came out the other side of it, they're like, well, why can't we get some of that COVID love for our disease? Just a little bit of it, and I think, objectively speaking, scientifically speaking, I can't say to them that there's no hope. In fact, I say the opposite. Technology is not limiting anymore. I think there could be 5 different fixes for your rare disease, just like there were 5 potential types of vaccines we could have taken. And then once everybody realized that, I think that's what's created a lot of excitement, but also a lot of like, oh man, how are we going to fund all this? Because sure, when the world's economy is frozen, what else? Nothing else matters. So every country's going to throw whatever dollar they have at it. But for your tiny rare disease, not so much, right? But so I think anyway, I see what you're saying, that there is a difference in the last few years that's never happened before, and many factors. But I think the major one is that we had this flippening, and technology and modalities were no longer limiting. It was really just the will and the coordination and the capital to make it happen.
Exactly. Everyone saw that the impossible is now possible. Like we can condense the number of years needed to do research and create a treatment from like 10 years or 4 years or whatever it is to like, a year.
As fast as we can do it, right?
As fast as
we can do it.
As fast as physically and humanly possible. If money was no issue, if resources and people and the technology was no issue, you just got to, churn through it, which is a lot of work, churning through all that lab work, research work, clinical work takes time. But if you had the right people to organize it, it's possible. And there's hope there now that it is possible and people are kind of motivated to do it. And that's great. I think I'm hoping that the next 10 years will become even more outstanding for everybody. I want to talk a little bit about being a public benefit company. It's just interesting because I'm sure there's many entrepreneurs out there listening, or maybe even investors who are considering, public benefit companies. What are some of the pros and cons to being a PBC?
Yeah, I kind of had hoped by now there'd be many more biotech PBCs out there. There definitely are. So like one of the notable ones I like to call out is Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug Company. That's a PBC. And there are others, but I would have hoped there would have been more. I'm not sure if it's because of there's some cons that are perceived or people don't see benefits to it. I'm not sure which it is. I don't think there's any cons. I mean, my first investor was Martin Shkreli, if you remember Pharma Bro. And his lawyers, very expensive Madison Avenue lawyers, didn't bat an eye in the term sheet and the contract when it said Perlar PBC. And I'm pretty sure they understood that was not something that every company did. But it's a type of a Delaware C corp. So it's not that crazy a notion. I guess maybe part of it is that people don't see the benefit of it because they're just like, well, I can just walk the walk as a company, and who cares what my articles of incorporation say. Especially if you're a private company, it's like the board and the shareholders, 50% plus one, they make all the decisions. So I don't know. I'm not sure why it hasn't caught fire. I think it will at some point. But for me, the benefits of a PDC have always just been the ability to say that we were the first, to just kind of be able to talk about PDCs and just spread the word. And being that evangelist has allowed me to talk to and meet a lot of interesting people in biotech, but it hasn't sparked like this movement. And like I said, I don't think people see themselves as evil because they don't set themselves up as a PBC. A lot of them, I just think that they just don't see the advantage necessarily from a tax point of view, because there really isn't. Like there aren't like advantages for tax or other reasons. So it's kind of like a statement more than anything. Mm-hmm. But I think at the end of the day, there will be more people embracing that label, especially as like Mark Cuban and Cost Plus, gets more and more disruptive and gets more and more attention. PBC hasn't been like the headline of the story about them, but I think it will be more. And Mark Cuban has a pretty big platform to talk about it. He hasn't, necessarily talked up the PBC concept. So I think there's room for plenty of headroom to grow. But I can tell you, 10 years in, for a while, it's pretty lonely being the only biotech PBC. But I do think, like a lot of things, we were ahead of our time, and the times are catching up.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, I feel like it would give like the board or the leadership more leeway to do things for the public benefit, right? Of course, for the patients, instead of quarterly results and things like that. So
you could, but as a private company, right, you can kind of do that. And I've heard arguments from other CEOs basically like, well, I can do that anyway. I don't need to have this title of a PBC. So,
yeah, that's true. Fair enough. So, personalized medicine, something that we hear all the time for the last decade, probably, and defined differently. How do you define personalized medicine? And do you think the industry will ever how can they truly achieve personalized medicine?
I mean, I think by talking about being a DTC biotech, that is actually, there's nothing more personalizing than that. So will the broader, will the legacy pharma companies like transition to becoming DTC? Like, of course, no, that just seems crazy. Or whatever. I don't want to speak too soon. Maybe. Never say never. But I think it's more likely it's the disruptive force from below than something that is kind of spilling over the tops from the companies that are currently on top. So I can't quite sort of predict the future there, but I mean, I say that being a DTC biotech makes us really kind of the ultimate personalized medicine company, because we're literally focused on people, a family. And when we talk about our research program, it's literally centered around the name of a child. And so there's nothing really more personalizing than becoming a DTC biotech, I think. But there's still a lot more that has to happen, I think, for it to really catch fire. Part of it, I think, is, you call it personalized medicine. There was a while there, it got rebranded as precision medicine. There was a time when it was, I can't remember, there was another individualized, there's been many different adjectives that have cycled through, probably 20 years total of people talking about this kind of stuff. So my way of formulating it is something I've called 1 to N. A lot of people have heard N of 1, right? Like N of 1, N of 1, like the single patient. But I think we almost overcorrected in the direction to N of 1. And yes, of course, everyone's disease is going to be theirs and uniquely theirs and so forth. But I think the clearer concept from a mathematical, statistical point of view is to say that every intervention is going to start with 1. And you can even look at Nobel Prizes that were awarded for a scientist that did a self-experiment, like the Nobel Prize for Barry Marshall for proving that ulcers were caused by a bacteria. He drank the solution that had the bacteria. So I think it's not a foreign concept that things would start with 1. And it's just that we never really, I think, had an orderly statistical process for how you would do these low end, small end studies. And so kind of the thing that I'm talking about is like 1 to N, saying, okay, forget about N of 1. Yes, N of 1 is true, but the reality is, in the limit, there is some human at some point in time or in the future who will have this same exact mutation. It's almost guaranteed, given how large the planet is, how many humans are, and just how the mutation rate works. So I think it's less productive to talk about N of 1. It's more productive to talk about 1 to N and how that first patient's a pioneer and how that first patient opening up and unlocking for others. And if you're doing an N of 1, like a single patient study, who's to say that you can't do that in a coordinated fashion? Who's to say that with our increasingly digitized, connected world, that literally through our phones, we could be organizing clinical trial where we have families that are kind of texting with each other and saying, here's I'm measuring this thing, and texting the result literally in a group thread. So I think that's the vision for personalized medicine to me is actually saying, all right, there are going to be these patients who are pioneers, medical pioneers, and they want to volunteer and they want to take on that risk. So let's harness that, and let's even coordinate a few of them. And so if you've got someone in New York and someone in Tokyo and someone in Lagos, and they all start a intervention, and they're taking the same intervention, right? And they all have the same disease. They can be kind of all in a group chat together, essentially running a clinical trial. And then I think if you have, and then imagine that everyone had baseline data because they all wore these things and they all had kind of a baseline going into the intervention. And so you have 3 different people starting interventions in 3 different places in 3 different parts of the world. And if they all show the same improvements, and those improvements are all recorded by that same device, are you going to say that's a coincidence? It's easy when there's an N of 1. And it's all
worth
by
digging
itself.
into at that point too. There becomes preliminary data, and you can generate lots of preliminary data and to help get these maybe future clinical trials started. So I think it makes sense. I think the challenge is like getting that one dashboard or system or platform that everyone agrees to use. Right now, I think there's many people trying to do this, but the issue is there's no standard for this yet. I think Apple's doing a pretty good job though with their health kit. So, and
they are exactly.
Fire standards are doing, that's useful too for collecting EHR data. But a lot of other pieces of information are just sort of recorded in unstructured data pieces or something. So yeah, it's really interesting. And of course your DNA, I mean, that's like something that we're still digging into in terms of like how we regulate people's DNA and store it.
But it's the concept of a minimum viable product, right? It's like, what's the MVP clinical trial? It's a few people. Yeah, actually one. In the limit, it's one, right? Exactly. But one can always be dismissed because one is vulnerable. One has no cover. But then then you have 2, and then skeptics can still say, you got, you've rolled the dice twice and you got snake eyes. Okay. But 3, then it's like there's smoke. And then 4, as you say, at a certain point, it becomes truth or it becomes real. What is that transition point? Is it at 5 to 6 patients to show it? It's like, how many people do you need to see a parachute work on before you agree that it's a good idea to use a parachute if a plane's crashing, right? How many randomized controlled trials do you need to see before you're like, I'm going to wear the parachute? So it's like the same idea, right? If you start to see enough of a signal, at what point do you sort of say this is happening? And yes, some patients will respond more than others. Some will, but like
Right.
we have
You're
to
gonna
reach
have
a point.
confounding factors. Yeah.
And there'll be always confounding factors, but at some point you need the concept of a minimum viable clinical trial to provide the validation to invest further, right? And make it so that 90% of trials don't fail. What if 90% of trials fail because the phase 1, 2, 3 is not actually the MVP. We haven't really been running MVPs. We've been jumping right into the product and calling it an MVP. But if we actually did a real MVP, maybe we wouldn't be facing 90% failure rates because we would only really be committing to those things that pass the MVP stage.
Interesting. So for Pilera, I know there's something called Cure Odysseys and Cure Guides. So Cure Guides can join the platform and help to guide these patients. But my question is, how much are people willing to actually pay for guided medical attention like this? Like, what is the willingness to pay amount?
And I can tell you because we've been sort of seeing what the market will bear for the last almost 2 years now. So we tend to charge one sort of flat rate of $350 an hour for kind of virtual consulting services, which I think is sort of in line with other types of professional services, whether it's a lawyer or other depending on their credential and their experience. So obviously there's lots of people who charge more than that. Certainly there are people who can charge less than that, but that's what we found is sort of our rate, our flat rate for our consulting work. And then for some of our lab services, we provide quotations based on the actual type of the project and what's involved. And those rates are not usually hourly rates. Those are more based on sort of chunks, milestone payments for a project, for a laboratory project. But I think what we've learned is that, for example, we know that there are sort of families out there who would be willing to pay for even a few hours of an expert's time if it was focused enough. Like, hey, I have this grant proposal from this researcher. I don't know if it's really up to snuff. Can you review and tell me thumbs up, thumbs down? And people will pay us a couple of hours worth of work to do that. So I think we're interested in exploring that as sort of like a Fiverr for rare disease advice. So PhD scientists, people who we call cure guides, who have some spare capacity in their day, it's not their full-time gig. They want to do this as a passion project and make some money on the side. We can kind of give them this chunks of work that these families need done, and it's very discreet. And then some groups can afford a retainer where it's sort of like a chunk of hours per month. And some groups have been on that arrangement for 2 years. But a lot of these foundations are community and immediate family funded. And so they only have so much in the tank before they run out of steam. But we often are also working with families that haven't set up any kind of charity. They're able to self-finance, and many of them are kind of discreetly doing so and can kind of operate and have kind of a more of an extended runway because they're sort of just one family and they're just kind of operating on research focus and not doing any community building, not doing any other stuff. So yeah, we've seen all sorts of sort of paying capacity and demand in terms of what services people want.
Interesting. So,
yeah.
We've talked about family foundations and how important they are. And just thinking about the broader ecosystem of biotech, you have the investors, pharma companies, researchers, early stage, later stage, clinical. How are they viewing family foundations now? Are they also starting to see some progress? I know that, large pharma companies also work with family foundations, maybe to a different degree than you may, but I just want to see what are the forces that interact with them?
I mean, I think there are plenty of, especially smaller biotechs that work very closely with like a patient advocacy group. And what are the business terms of the relationship? I don't always know. Some charities and foundations are smarter than others when it comes to negotiating for rights and for other things. Some of them don't think about that because they're so, caught up in the moment or just caught up in anyone helping them that they don't think that they have negotiating power. But yeah, there's nothing, it's very usual for patient groups and especially in rare diseases to work closely with companies, even the bigger companies as well, the Roches, the Novartises. They have divisions and smaller groups that would be focused on rare diseases and would make contact with groups. they're trying to get data, they're trying to get samples, they're trying to figure out who's interested in clinical trials, they're trying to recruit to clinical trials. So it's all things that the families want. Usually it's a very mutually beneficial arrangement. But at the end of the day, it's not always clear if these foundations are truly like acting as sophisticated in a manner that they should, in terms of like demanding certain kinds of commercial or other terms, and not just being walked all over, let's say, or not just ceding and giving up all their IP or rights to the university or the other partner. So I don't know how generous companies are in terms of like sharing upside, but I think I remember an example not too long ago. There was a foundation called, I think, the Progeria Research Foundation, focused on progeria, and they ended up helping a biotech company that got a drug approval, and the foundation, the Progeria Foundation, ended up sharing in the proceeds of like the sale of the asset. So they negotiated pretty well, but I'm pretty sure there's lots of other foundations that maybe didn't do so well or didn't know to do that. I'm not casting any blame, but I think, especially nowadays, most people learn pretty quickly, if you're starting a foundation, that you should have certain rights, and that you shouldn't just let universities or biotech walk all over you just because you feel grateful someone's working on your disease.
And now, with the upcoming Web3 technologies that we're seeing, I know there's still a lot of room for regulation there, and a lot of room for scalable technology for the people. There is still this idea of decentralization and the possibility of patients or communities owning a piece of the IP that they contribute to. That could be their data, it could be their time or money or something like that. I don't want to get into a full discussion on tokens or anything, but yeah, are you thinking, or are you seeing that this trend is continuing?
I think so. I mean, I would like to one day think that clinical trial participants can get financially reimbursed for their sacrifice and their time. And a great way to do that might be on, you get an airdrop of whatever token for participating, and you vest. The longer you stay in the trial, the more compliant you are. I know for a fact that we have folks who don't take every pill when they're supposed to take it. That you got to write that down in your clinical trial. What if you could increase compliance rate by? So I think the bioethicists will scream bloody murder, but at the end of the day, I just think, just step back for a second. You have a group of people that sacrifices their time, their blood, their lots of things, literally the blood, sweat, and tears. And yes, they're getting access to a medication before everyone else. That's true. But then that company gets to use that data to get a drug approval that is worth a lot of money. And the patients who volunteer for that trial don't see any of that money. And they're told, well, you're not supposed to, your reward was getting the drug. Like, basically just like, who you would even ask for this? And it's like, anyone in business would be like, yo, where's my piece? Hello, I was an early stage, I was an angel investor, essentially. I mean, yes, I got diluted, but hey, I exist. Like, I should get. So I'm one of those, and maybe that's considered radical, but I actually 100% agree that, however we do it, whatever the exact rail, there is a way to allow for clinical trial participants to get compensation and rewarded for their participation in creating the research and the data that ends up being commercially very valuable. And one day, maybe a DAO owns the drug itself, and then distributions can flow just like they would through, shareholders through a private company, or through a dividend, to a public shareholder. So I think, yeah, I'm not going to be running that first experiment in Web3. I'm a fan, but like, I'm not going to be a Web3 pioneer. But once that gets settled, and the land is arable, and like, I'm happy to settle. But yeah, I think we're still a ways from it. But I'm a radical. I think people should get paid for their contributions, and kind of in proportion to their contribution, and medicine should be no different.
Yeah, and that infrastructure is still getting built out. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. But you could also think of just the recruitment incentives would be insane, like insanely good, I think. So
I mean, I already know from the trial we're running that just because people are part of a community together, just Facebook alone has kind of given people a reason to care about each other, and they do amazing things as a community because of that. And now, add on top of that, the natural kind of inducements and incentives of a financial reward if you actually succeed, not just like getting rewarded for doing nothing. Like, I think we've seen that in the great experiment of capitalism, that's not such a bad idea. And it scales. And yes, there's things to be aware of, and it's not perfect, but like I don't see anything that does it better. So, but yeah, I'm watching with great excitement for these kind of Web3 personalized medicine experiments to mature, and they will.
Fair enough. Let's jump back into like the Web 2 or traditional space a little bit. What kind of support do early stage biotech companies need to make them successful in fundraising?
I mean, now I got to remember what it's like to be in that mode. It's been a few years since I've actively, I guess, had to fundraise. On the other side, I've become now an investor. So I see lots of companies, I see lots of opportunities. I guess, obviously, if you're sort of, I don't know, well, it depends obviously on the stage, seed, pre-seed, A. But I guess, and obviously like the conditions here have been not great in terms of like fundraising for almost a year now. So I can't really tell you anything like useful, I think, if you're fundraising right now. But I guess the thing that I've been saying, so I'll just be consistent for years now, is I think every biotech should kind of consider the following. You're told, oh, you need to get preclinical proof of concept. You need to get your mouse model or your rat model or whatever, anything but the actual human being that you think you're going to affect. And I always kind of push back and say, well, all right, let's say you did your mouse study and you looked at 10 mice and it looked amazing. And then you did 100 mice and it looked amazing still. And then I said, what if I gave that same drug to one human being? What data would you care more about? The positive data from the human or the 100 positive mice? And then obviously everyone says the human. And then at some point, it's like you realize there's no amount of mouse. Like even if I had a data set with 1 million mice and they all were cured, would that matter more than one human? Like there is no amount of mice that would ever be worth more than one human. So once you kind of accept that, I think everyone should reorient their company so that their first inflection point is, well, after kind of demonstrating the technology, their first real inflection point is clinical proof of concept in one human being. Because so instead of like trying to pay for this beautiful rat study or whatever that proves it in 50 rats, what if you could use that same money and time to show that you got a signal of efficacy in one human being? So I think I always challenge people to think that way. And most of the time, everyone says no, or they don't, because like in the pharma, in the business development world, they're not looking for N of 1 data. They don't know how to process that. They want to see the mouse. They have a certain flow. So no one in the current thing is ever going to encourage anyone to break out of this jam. But I think if everyone decided, fuck them mice, excuse my French, but forget about the rodent. Let's use all of our money and resources to race to get clinical proof of concept in the human. It'd be like with the vaccines. What if we had raced toward a challenge trial? Instead of trying to get the perfect randomized control trial with 30,000 patients, and it all looked great. The data looked amazing, right? Everyone was blown away. What if we could have gotten there faster?
Yeah.
That's sort of the provocation.
I think the FDA last year or so, I think we had people are able to submit data and skip mice for certain drugs, not all drugs, but for safety studies, which is
the
so
law
it's a little faster.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
I think we're getting there, right? I think, there's basically Congress passed the latest law saying that eventually you phase out animal testing for tox. So I think we're going to get there. And like, I think, yes, the reality is the sooner you can get into a human being, the better. And if that means taking that risk, well, then we better get better at what we put into humans. And we know we can get better. We know we can step up. So animals are not going to bail us out here. We gotta figure out a way to get into human beings as quick as possible. So that's my advice I give to every founder, no matter what their platform, no matter what disease. And I don't know if anyone's listening, but I think someday people will.
Awesome. Well, Ethan, I have one final question, and I want you to put your scientist and futurist hat on for this one.
Okay.
What kind of specific biotechnologies do you see making the biggest impact on human health in the next few years? Let's call it 3 years.
I mean, my answer is that it's not actually a technology as we classically define it. It's this idea I was harping on, that it's the patients who are the platform. It's the fact that they will decide, I've got 50 different options. I've got RNA, I've got, CRISPR, I've got base editor. Like, it's going to turn out that there's not just going to be one fix for one disease. There's going to be multiple fixes for every disease, just like there were multiple vaccines for one COVID. I think that is going. So if that's true, then we the ultimate platform is the families. It's the consumer.
It's the individual.
It's not. We're not waiting for, and that is. And I think A16Z even said that in a recent podcast about that really. It's like the user is the platform or the patient is the platform. And I know that has a kind of connotation in a Web 2 sense that's bad, but I'm using it in a sense where it's more like, it's not like there's going to be this one magic invention that will cure all diseases. I mean, maybe the gene therapy maxi will tell you it is. Maybe the gene editing maxi will tell you that theirs is the one ring to rule them all. I would say the one ring to rule them all is actually the parent and the patient. And if you think about it that way, if you empowered them, the technology is sitting there. How much advance would you unlock if you just basically gave them the capital and the know-how to run with the technology that already exists? And then new technologies will continue to fall from the labs. And yes, there'll be that one ring to rule them all, maybe. But in the meantime, we don't need to build any new technology. We just need to mobilize the platform that's already there. And it's a distributed platform. It's already a decentralized platform because the parents are everywhere. They're in all the countries of the world. They're spread out throughout all sectors of society, right? So that's my thesis. The futurist, it's the boring answer is us. We are the answer. Although I think actually that's a pretty exciting possibility.
Absolutely. I mean, I share your passion. I think, us individuals, people, families, they hold the keys to life, and we need to discover them more quickly. And funding is part of that equation. So again, thank you so much for your time today on the show, speaking to us about your company a little bit and just the industry overall. And I welcome you anytime. Is there any final words you want to say to the audience before we conclude here?
I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but I think it's sort of never been a better time in history to get a rare genetic disease, because we know this is a solvable problem. And there's also a community that will support you in this effort. So we're going to science the shit out of it. It was Mars before, and we're going to, make it rare genetic diseases on planet Earth will be next.
Fantastic. Thank you.